Everyone, my name is Gerard. I'm from Barcelona, actually. I live in Boulder. Um, but I'm here to present the AIP-31, which is Airflow Improvement Proposal 31, which talks about Airflow Functional DAG. This is a new feature coming in Airflow 2.0, which was introduced. We talked about this in the Airflow 2.0 talk. Tomic introduced this. With that said, I'm gonna start introducing myself. I'm then gonna explain the motivation on the functional DAG. I'm gonna introduce the two topics, Explicit SCOM and XCom arc, and add task decorator, which is two of the main components of the AIP-31. And I'm finally gonna end by talking about some future work that can be done on this functional DAG area. Okay, so introducing myself. I'm a software engineer at Twitter. I work on ML platforms, so a lot of the things that I'm going to talk sometimes are going to refer to ML in specific, and like Airflow and ML. If you are interested in how do we use Twitter, Airflow at Twitter, you might check my colleague's Dan talk from Tuesday. I don't remember. I think the session was like how big companies use Airflow, but you can check that out. And you can also follow me. Of course, I work at Twitter, so I have a Twitter account. So you can also follow me at Casas Saez. I don't post a lot about work, but it's always I'm saying that myself, but it's an interesting account to follow. So why functional DAGs? Why do we care, and why all this came about? To talk about the functional DAGs, I'm gonna be presenting an ETL pipeline throughout the presentation, and so I'm gonna introduce that first. First of all, this is a super simple ETL pipeline. It basically does a job that we basically every day I want an email on my email inbox that sends me what's the external IP of the Airflow server. And so this can be decomposed into three tasks. So like one is the extract, which is basically I'm just gonna do a GET request to an external server, in this case HTTP bin. I'm just gonna get the external IP on a huge JSON. This is the data generated by the extract task. It's like a JSON. Then I'm going to transform this. I'm going to pass the JSON. I'm going to extract the external IP from there. I'm going to format it into an email subject and content or a body. And then I'm going to load it, which is going to be just like sending me an email. It's a super simple ETL pipeline, but it's going to be a good example of how do we went from the problem to the solution, and kind of illustrating this, how it works on Airflow. And so one of the things that you might notice on the ETL is that there's data that is being passed around. And so there's several ways that you can pass data around between operators in Airflow. One of them could be basically using templated fields, or like execution date, task ID, etc., file path generated, and store them in a shared file system, so like HDFS, GCS. And so you could generate, for example, like a task file path based on your date, and then task ID, and then basically the downstream operator needs to be able to read that using the same template and just read the file. Or the other one is using XCom. It's a metadata sharing, message metadata passing between operators for Airflow, which is basically just the key value on the Airflow database. We prefer XCom, at least on our side. Mostly because sometimes the data fits on the DB. That's in our case, model training metrics. Like you don't really need to write into a file the training metrics. Like it's a small JSON, it fits on the DB, so like you can just pass it around on an XCom. It also allows you for a more flexible path. Like there's always a limit to how much you can templatize a path. Like there's you might need to templatize when you start working with several HDFS clusters or several backends like HDFS and GCS. You might need to templatize that as well. It becomes a bit harder. And so there's certain limitations, while XCom is basically you just pass the path around and that's it. Like you generate the path, you pass it to the downstream operator, and you don't really need to like remember how you generated it between operators. It's also more reusable because of that. Just like you don't really need to use, if you need to generate several files, you can just pass several XCom instead of having to generate in some way the files. And it's also visible from the web UI, so it's easier to debug in this case. And it's also already used by a lot of open source Airflow operators, so might as well. With that said, I'm going to expose, so like the ETL pipeline that I introduced, this is a vanilla Airflow DAG that does that exact same usage that I mentioned. So the extract, the transform, and load. I'm going to use the pointer. But like we have the extract, which is a simple HTTP operator that by default pings HTTP bin. We could change it to ping something else, but in this case, it's fine. We just basically pass down the XCom JSON, and then we do some custom transformation, which we use a Python operator that basically just pulls the previous JSON, loads it, extracts the origin, which is the external IP, and then parses the subject and body XCom values that are passed down to an email operator, which is the load transform, like the load step, that basically just sends a subject and content to my email. And so this is an Airflow vanilla. Like you can do this on Airflow right now. Like there's nothing custom from Twitter. There's nothing custom from like latest versions or anything. This is a really vanilla DAG. Some things to mention here is the fact that like on one side you can see the Python operator, you need to pass it the transform, and then you also need to get the task instance to XCom pull, and you need to XCom push then. This is a bit of a not super great. When I need to write this, I need to know what XCom is, and I need to know that I need to pull and then push. And there's something also interesting here. There's something that you might miss. Like if you look at this DAG, you might not notice this at first. If you've been developing for an Airflow for a long time, you might notice, but this is not going to run successfully because it actually misses one small point, which is like you need to set also the task dependencies. Like you're passing XCom around, but Airflow is not aware of that. Like it's not aware that this is a task dependency as well. So like you need to explicitly say that the task need to execute in an order in order to reach to success. If you don't do that, it's going to basically run into race conditions, and it's not going to run successfully. Another thing to mention is like we use templated fields here. There's other ways that you could do subject or XCom pull extraction from operators. You could write your own operator and XCom pull from there, but it's not really reusable then. So in this case, we just use a templated field. We get the context, the task instance, and do the XCom pull there. So that's why it's here. So that's kind of a bit of the motivation behind this. It's ETL workflows resemble a lot like functions. There's this great article from Maxime, which I don't remember what year it was, but it's the functional data engineering article that talks exactly about that. In my case, I did my own interpretation of this. So like functions are mapped to operators on Airflow, and variables are kind of difficult to map. It's like a data artifact, but it's an XCom metadata. So like it's more of an implicit artifact that you pass around. It's not really well represented on the Airflow ecosystem itself. But you can still you can implicitly pass around things with XCom, and like that's kind of where the implicit calls. Also, even though you are actually passing implicitly data around, you need to explicitly declare task dependencies, which is as I mentioned, like that was not super intuitive at first unless you've been using Airflow for long enough. And then one last thing, it's the writing custom function operators. It's a bit hard. It's not super intuitive. If you look at the email, like the Python operator, and this is not like a super great example. Like this doesn't have any args or key arguments. But like if you have to pass args and key arguments, you need to like pass the list and the dictionary. And if you've ever programmed in Python, that's not really how you use Python. You usually like just like pass the arguments, and then that Python knows how to do that. And so like one of the other motivations was like, how can we simplify this to make it easier? Can we simplify using ad hoc, custom transformation, custom functions from Airflow? And so that's three of the motivations. Some prior art inspiration. The first one is actually something that I discovered after the fact, which is like the streamlined functional Airflow roadmap. It's a document on the Airflow Confluence page that basically talks about a similar concept, which is functional DAGs. But it's nice to see that we actually ended up reaching the same state that it was proposed a while back. But yeah. And then another inspiration, it was really heavily, is Twitter. Twitter has an internal fork that basically has a typed XCom arg, which is a lazily evaluated class for XCom values. We actually talk about this. There's an ML workflows, if you look it up, blog post that you can look it up, and it explains that. And some other inspiration prior art has been due to our current investigations on ML pipelines that we're doing at Twitter. if you want to learn more, my colleagues Dan talk about this more. So I recommend that watching that. But like some of the inspirations come from perfect functional DAG, Dagster pipelines and solids, TensorFlow extended pipelines, the Square Bionic pipelines, etc. And so like some of the concepts that you'll see on this AIP and some of the implementations are inspired on like the APIs that they define. So with that said, a little bit of the motivation around this, let's talk about explicit XCom. So like XCom are implicit, let's make them explicit. The XCom arg class, it's basically a reference to future XCom values. So it's just a lazy evaluated class that you can use on your DAGs. And then basically in the future, they execute, they can be set on templated fields, and they resolve on execution time. And so it's the equivalent of using the templated string, like the templated long string that I mentioned before, the context, the XCom pool, etc., sorry. And then it has a method that is the resolve, that it's basically just does the TI XCom pool. You can use it on DAG definitions, and it has some affordances. We added some affordances to it that makes user experience a bit easier. Like we implemented the get item, which basically allows you to change the key, and the dot output. And finally, one important thing that I've been mentioning, it does actually declare implicit task dependency. So instead of having to declare explicit task dependency, implicit XCom passing, you do the opposite. You explicitize XCom and you implicitly declare the task dependencies. By the way, I mentioned we because there's more people that have been working on this. It's not like I have a huge ego. So I'll talk about this at the end, but yeah. And so we go from this vanilla Airflow DAG to where we need to basically do XCom pool and etc., and like do all these super long string and like dependency, task dependency declaration, to a simpler DAG that basically you can. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. XCom args are resolved if you set them on templated fields. That's important. So op args on Python operator is actually a templated field, so it gets resolved on execution time. And basically what you can do is you get the extract operator and you use the dot output property that we added to base operator that generates an XCom arg for that operator. And then you can set it here, and this gets loaded as the content, which is the JSON in this case, from the HTTP request. And so that allows us to avoid having to do TI XCom push, XCom pull, sorry. And it basically makes this more easier. It just like happens on, like Airflow does this for us. You might notice here, it's, oh yeah, something else. It's also like you can, we XCom push the subject and body still. We could actually return only one value. Python operator allows you to return one value and that gets XCom pushed automatically. But in this case, we need to push two values, which is something that it's not well supported right now, or at least before this. And that's kind of where we need to explicitly push these two values. And then we set them on the downstream operator on using again, like the output property. And in this case, we use the set item to set the key for subject and body. And so these are perfectly functional. It's the same DAG as the one I presented before. And it also, as you can see, it actually doesn't need the explicit task dependencies, which is nice. Airflow automatically detects that this is a dependency between tasks. And so like it just sets the dependencies automatically. And so one thing that I mentioned as well was like the Python operators not being super easy to use, and so that's where we introduced the add task decorators. So we use Python decorators to make this thing of creating operators from a function easier. And so right now, if you need to create a Airflow operator from a Python function, you basically need to do this really verbose way of setting things. With the XCom arg, you can actually. Well, this is the XCom arg example, by the way. But you can see here that we set the op args as a list. If you had to use op qart, you would have to set the dictionary. This is, if you've ever used Python, this is not how you use Python functions. I mean, it would be really annoying if every time you need to use the function, you need to pass a list and then a dictionary. And so the good thing, though, is we have Python decorators, which allows us to do some custom transformations and basically wrap this around in a more Python-y way, I guess. But yeah, so like this is where we introduce the add task decorator. You can use it either by using the airflow.decorators.task, which is a new module from in Airflow Master, and I guess it's going to be released on Airflow 2.0. Or you can use it also using the property on the DAG object, which is DAG task. So I'm going to use the second one mostly because it looks a bit nicer to me, but both of them work. The thing is that you can call the decorated function to generate Python operators, and this call actually sets the op args and the opq args without having to explicitly say the list and the dictionary. Another cool thing, it supports multiple outputs. So if you return a dictionary and you tell it that this is a multiple outputs, it unrolls the dictionary into multiple XCom values. And finally, another thing that we added is the generate task IDs. So like you can basically decorate a function and use it multiple times, and it will automatically generate task IDs for each time that you call it. So yeah, it returns the default XCom arg, so like you can use it on a really functional manner to reuse. Some breaking thing from Python operator in this case is that it doesn't support the context Q arg. So basically, with Python operator, you can access the context of the Airflow context. In this case, we don't support that from the function itself, but we're adding, Tomek is actually adding this on an upcoming pull request, a get current context function that works similar to how flash.request works, which is populated on the request time. And then basically you can access the Airflow context on a Python operator without having to like modify your function signature. And so with that presented, we go from the previous DAG that we had, XCom arg and had this Python operator thing here, and all these things here that are, to something that is a bit cleaner, which is using the add DAG task, which basically just decorates the function. We call that, as I mentioned, we have multiple outputs. We need to output the subject and the body. And so we call it that we need multiple outputs, and then we wrap the function. We just load the external IP, extract it from the JSON, and then return to a dictionary with two values that are basically the subject and the body. We just use F strings here for formatting. And then the only thing that remains is basically calling it as we would call any function. And so we get the extract.output, which is the XCom arg from the previous task. And then it returns a class, which is an XCom arg class again, object, sorry. And then we can use this to set the subject and the HTML content on the ML operator. And so this looks way more Pythonic. Something that you may notice is it no longer says anything about XCom. And so that's kind of a nice thing. And because you can basically abstract away the fact that it's XCom, that it's the values that it's being passed around. You could potentially transform that into being something else if you wanted. And so this is a bit more intuitive, and it's like Airflow does a bunch more things and declares the task dependencies, etc., which is nice. And so that's currently the current status on master, except the get current context, which is currently being worked on. But what's some next things that we might want to add, or some things that would, like some ideas that we can throw around? So one of them is the add DAG decorator. This is a small idea that I had and discussed with a few Airflow people, but basically apply the same concept that we did on the add task, but to create DAGs, and kind of doing a DAG constructor, which is also a concept from ML workflows, but basically allow to parameterize DAGs and create DAGs from easier with functions. This is also inspired by Kubeflow pipelines. If anyone has used that, it's interesting. Another thing is also type hint support for multiple outputs. So right now you need to explicitly declare that the output is going to be multiple outputs, but you could basically do something similar that Panda does, which is like just inspect the signature and basically check whether that is multiple outputs or not. And finally, something that is already on master, actually, it's not future work, but it's kind of like somewhere where people can start to try things, is custom XCom backend. This basically allows you to change what's the backend for XCom on master, like the latest master of Airflow. And that basically would allow you to customize the serialization of a specific Python classes or handle I/O for shared file systems. So like an example here would be, I want to basically use pandas data frames, and I want to serialize these into CSVs into my shared HDFS file system, and then basically load that again. And so what I could do is basically create a custom XCom backend, override the serialize and deserialize functions, and basically whenever I serialize and I find that it's a pandas data frame, I'll put this into HDFS and then pass the XCom value at JSON that basically says this is a data frame and the data frame is in this path. And then when I need to deserialize, I see that and basically do the opposite process. I basically say, okay, this is a data frame, so I'm going to deserialize from this path and load it. And this allows you to do something nicely, which is you can start to do things like transformations of data frames without really needing to actually access GCS or like write any custom code that you need to reuse between steps. And so you can, for example, do a multiplication of columns on the data frame and then return it. And then you can also do another one and return it. And this on the background is serializing into a CSV and loading it into HDFS or GCS or whatever, and then deserializing and doing all this for you. And so it reduces a lot of boilerplate code. Regarding the DAG decorator, it's not really a defined project at this point. It's more of an idea that I'm throwing out there. But it's basically, if you were able to decorate a function and basically create the DAG in there, then basically you could parameterize it and start reusing the pipeline, the DAG with different paths, or change the path, or change other parameters. And the nice thing is it's also like from Airflow 1.10.10, I believe, it's there was an addition of parameterizing DAGs, and so like we could easily integrate that with that, and it would allow you to use the UI for setting custom parameters for your DAG and then launching it. And so that's the idea. And as I mentioned, I said we a few times because I did not do this alone. There's this functional ops special interest group, which is, if you want to join, it's also a Slack channel on the Airflow Slack channel. We've been working on this for the past few months, and this is the result, kind of. I just want to say kudos to Tomek, Evgeny, and Jonathan, which is the three main contributors to this work. And then thank you to all the Airflow community reviewers and committers like Fishilash, Gerard here, and Dan, to reviewing the PRs and being really patient with me as well. So appreciate that. With that said, that's about it.
Very much for that. Thank you very much, Gerardo, for that. I think that was very, for me, I was observing that from a little bit from the side, because you mentioned Tomek, so we work together, and I know Tomek has the passion for functional programming and data science. And I just left it to him because I didn't want to interfere at all. But now, seeing your presentation, that explains a lot about the motivation and how it is made easier. And especially, what I see is like it's just bridging the gap between the programming, the kind of programmers and data scientists even closer. Like Airflow is meant for that. So let me start with the questions that are already posted. So the first comment is that it's an amazing feature, which I totally agree with. How big is an adoption of your original task at Twitter? What are the three main problems you have with task with your current pipelines?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question. We actually did not implement a task internally. Like this was an idea that came from the so like XCom, it is implemented internally. Like there is an internal fork that does that. But the add task was an idea that came up while we were like I was like writing the proposal for the XCom arc, and I was like, well, actually, it would make a lot more sense to like do this. So it is not implemented at Twitter right now. So we don't have a lot of insights on there. But yeah, and the main problems are, yeah, we don't really have a lot. We've seen a lot of people use the Python operator, and that's kind of where it came from. It's like, it seems like it's a rather common use case that it could be easier to use. And if we make things easier, it would make sense. So that was the motivation.
Okay, I hope it will be much more used in Airflow 2.0 when it ships. Well, it looks like it's going to be much easier to use, definitely. I have my question. Like I will sneak in my question, which
Sure.
I had. So this functional DAG is really mostly for like for Python callables, yeah, for functions.
Mhm.
Is there any way we can make it easier? Also, have you thought about that? Making easier to use the custom operators in similar fashion? Like I'm thinking mostly about the implicit dependencies. It seems like
Mhm.
there might be some kind of way to make it easier to write DAGs without these explicit dependencies. What any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think at least for me, like how I see this is the adding. So we added the dot output to base operator that basically allows you to create the SCOM arc automatically without having to explicitly declare that. And so I think that even though like the whole AIP and proposal is really focused on functional programming, like at the decorator and et cetera, like you could use this without having to use the add task decorator. Like you could use this basically to tie around different operators that are custom operators with the dot output. This is something that we've already seen and used around, like for example, we tie a pipeline that has a model training, and then after the model training, we do some model evaluation before we launch it into production or something like that. And so what you want to do here is you basically pass the XCom and then set the dependency as well. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I think the dot output, I'm not sure if there's probably better ways to make it look. But yeah, I think that it can be used with the dot output and the templated fields already.
Okay, so I hope I've planted a seed there. Maybe something great comes out of those great minds. Now, a second question that I see from the audience: do you think that Airflow should ship with few custom XCOM classes?
It's difficult to answer. That's at least I don't. I'm not sure. It might be a good thing to have a few examples. What I would say is that I believe it's probably useful. Like the problem is like you're never going to be able to generalize enough all these problems, right? Like it depends. Each company will have different problems for passing message around between operators. Like for example, at Twitter we use HDFS and we use GCS and we have a lot of custom things here that might change. It might make sense to make a few general ones. But I think the idea here is also like living and like the idea when we added this, and Tomic can probably explain more at some point. But the idea was to like creating it and see what the community does with this. And so like that's kind of why I called it out here. Is like if you have an idea that you want to implement it and you think it might be reusable by other people, like talk to us. It's interesting and might be worth adding to Airflow Master, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so the next question is rather similar to what I asked IC. So could this be extended beyond Python-based tasks, for example, Spark submit operator? So I guess you already kind of answered that. Yeah.
Yeah, the Spark use case is actually an interesting one. I
Okay.
really I think it would be really interesting to actually have a wrapper that you can basically write your Spark Python there, and then basically that gets submitted or interactively submitted. That would be interesting, but that's just throwing
And
ideas out there.
and maybe a follow up on that, because the talk from astronomer Rai
Mhm.
was mentioning this task progress possibility. So maybe that also sounds like pretty much like functional, to provide some function that is called when there is a progress on the Spark submit call. So that sounds like something might come out of it. I hope. Like I volunteered to help Rai with that, so maybe maybe we'll do something together in
I
the
mean,
future.
that looking forward to that.
So another question we have: do you think that Airflow with AIP-31 will be more often used to process the data on its own without delegating the job to external services? That's a very interesting question.
Um, the short answer is no. Like it ends up being like Airflow is an orchestration system, so like no, but yes. It's kind of a difficult question because you could, for example, use Spark and like start abstracting away like your custom Spark classes to like delegate execution to Spark, and like have a really good integration between Airflow and Spark to do that. I don't think Airflow is a data processing framework. It's more of an orchestration framework. We're just making the AIP-31. It also introduces some things that make data processing easier, but like it's still like at scale. You're probably going to be easier finding Spark or other data processing frameworks for this. The thing is, if we can integrate this well on Airflow, that will make things easier to orchestrate. Like that kind of ends up being like a thing that you need always. Like you need to orchestrate tasks between and task dependencies of heterogeneous tasks. Like sometimes you want to start with Spark and then you do, I don't know, Dataflow, whatever, and you do other stuff later. And so having these integrations will be interesting, but
that's I also see that like more help or like nicer writing the dependencies rather than doing the job themselves. That makes perfect sense, I think. Will there be an example job with XCom arcs in Airflow 2.0?
Yeah.
Yes.
There will be. We have an open GitHub issue that we need to work on. That it's basically just creating an example DAG or refactoring the example DAG to use XCom arc. But either one, we'll have one that it's an example for sure.
Okay, and I have my own question now. Another one. Is there any like how difficult would it be to bring this to 1.10 users? Is that something that you thought of, considered, discussed? Because
I think we talked about this with Kashil. I think it should be feasible to bring it to 1.10. It's the main issue with 1.10 is that there's a bunch of like Python 3 code. Like there is the new functional, like a lot of the code that we added has like F strings or stuff like that is Python 3 specific. And so that might need to be refactored to bring it back to 1.10. But yeah, I guess it also depends on like how the Airflow 2.0 release goes. If it happens soon, then it's no need for that. But that's
I would love to see a little bit more reasons in the future for people to migrate to 2.0 as fast as possible. And I see that more like this kind of feature that people would really want and that make them migrate faster. That's something that we would all love, I think. And speaking about new features and Airflow 2.0, there is a discussion also. Maybe you can tell a little bit what your thoughts about that are. I know that like connecting functional DAGs and lineage that Bolke is a big proponent of. This is something that came up quite frequently in the discussion. So maybe you can share some thoughts how this can be connected or disconnected, or what your thoughts about that.
Yeah, the APIs are kind of similar, but in a similar way. I think like ideally we would be able to connect those in an easier way. But right now they are disconnected. Like it was two work streams happening at the same time. I actually proposed like AIP-31 came from the conversation where Paul proposed the data lineage proposal, and that's kind of like where it spin up its own discussion and separate discussion than like the whole AIP-31 work. But yeah, I think like at least in my opinion, it makes a lot of sense to like not merge them, but like make them more seemingly integrate with each other. Like especially with the lineage work integrated with Amundsen or some other framework, which I don't know, for data lineage. But that would be interesting to see as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So there is one more question I see here. How are most people using Airflow? That maybe I don't know if that's the question for you. Is it for data processing or orchestration? My case is using it for orchestrating jobs in ECS tasks. It's not necessarily related, but how is Twitter using it most?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We use it for both. The interesting thing about Twitter is that we adopted it mostly for ML orchestration at the beginning, and then it kind of went off to be also used for like other stuff like job orchestration and data data orchestration or data pipeline orchestration in a way. But yeah, I'm not sure what the question was, but yeah, it is used for both things.
Yes. How are people using it mostly? But of course, you cannot know how most people can use it, but you know how Twitter, and
Yeah,
I'm really interested in hearing that more. All right. Just looking if there are any more questions coming, but in case not, yes, that's. Thank you very much. That was really insightful and really great to know the motivations and where functional DAGs came from. Oh, wait, we have another
I have
one.
another one.
Okay, okay, good. So let's wait for it. Um, let's make a little bit of yeah. That's a good one. What do you think about joining Airflow community? The at task PR was your first one. I think I
Yeah,
know who asked that question, even though I don't see the person.
uh, yeah. I'm guessing. Well, there's more than one people, I think, but yeah, it's been great. I think the starting with such a large PR, it might not be the best idea for like a person who wants to join the community. Like it was great, but it was like it took a while. Like I mean, it's normal. It's a pretty long PR. But yeah, it's honestly been great. It's a great experience. It's a good project to contribute to. So if you haven't, you should. Um, and the people was really nice and like took the time to like help me on board. Like especially like I mentioned like Tomek and like all the people have been really helpful on this. But yeah, it's been great. It's honestly a great experience. I don't recommend doing such a large PR to start. I probably would start with a smaller PR if I had to do it again. But it's nice. It's a
Okay,
great
so
experience.
you are definitely most welcome to for new smaller PRs. Many of them we would love to have you more contribute more because that was a really great and valuable contribution. So we are hoping for more. Thank you again for this presentation. That was again very insightful and great. Uh, and so the next session is gonna start in more or less 15-20 minutes. If there are any questions which you still want to ask, you can for the attendees, and you can still ask them on the Airflow Summit attendees channel in on Slack. Thank you again, and
Thank you.
let's take the break for waiting for the next talk.
Yep. Thank you so much for hosting and for moderating.
Thank you.